Okay, so I was wanting to do like Matt Fraction's run of Iron Man that starts with Believe and goes through like the secret origin of Tony Stark and like the introduction of Arno Stark and different things like that. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that a lot of that comes out of Avengers versus X-Men. And then the more I thought about Avengers versus X-Men, the more I realized that a lot of stuff comes out of Avengers versus X-Men. Really everything that leads up to like Secret Wars really comes out of Avengers versus X-Men. A lot of the stories with characters that are just kind of, wrapping up or, loose ends, different things like that. But even within the story of Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers. For example, the animosity between Black Panther and Namor the Submariner is rooted in Avengers versus X-Men. And so because of that, I was like, well, I mean, it's 12 issues. We can just do it in 2 videos and then just call it a day. So I figured, why not do Avengers versus X-Men? It's called Avengers versus X-Men. So here's the deal. Really, a lot of this winds back all the way to House of M. Ego Raptor, if you see this video, hopefully this helps. For those of you guys who don't know, Ego Raptor, who's part of Game Grumps, had a big question about what to read after House of M with regards to the X-Men, and Marvel did not make it easy. I mean, they released like 7 different X-Men publications. It was stupid. But following the events of House of M, that story in and of itself was just designed for the purpose of really kind of reducing the mutant population. But what Marvel had under their belt after that were just like a litany of different stories that writers were creating. And all of this led up to Avengers versus X-Men. And so there's like 4 main things, really, with regards to the X-Men themselves, because they're the main focus here. There's like 4 main things that come out of this story. The first is Cyclops, the second is Charles Xavier, the third is the mutant population, and the fourth is Hope Summers. So starting with Hope, she's really kind of like the big picture character here. After House of M, the mutant population was down to like 198, and it was really designed for the purpose of just kind of offering some measure of a clean slate, which is to say the mutant population had grown to be so huge and so unruly that editor-in-chief Joe Quesada was like, let's just reduce it down to an almost minuscule number and then just kind of start over, focus on the core X-Men that we have, and then just kind of grow it organically from there. The problem is that there were so many events going on that Marvel never really had a chance to sit down and let the X-Men breathe. Instead, we got House of M, and then we were immediately followed by Civil War, where the X-Men were just hands off, and then we were immediately followed by Secret Invasion, and then Dark Reign, and then Siege, and then Fear itself, and there were just all these stories that were going on that Marvel never really had a chance to let the X-Men breathe properly because they had to constantly roll them over into these stories. And so no one could sit down and really do any great storytelling with the X-Men themselves. But there were a handful of stories that are important. There's really only 3 that are really significant with the character of Hope Summers. The first is Messiah Complex, the second is Messiah War, and the third is Second Coming. And with these 3 stories, what they did is they basically introduced the character of Hope. And Marvel had kind of teased this idea of, well, Hope Summers, she might be the next Jean Grey, that kind of thing. But the idea was that she would be the host of the Phoenix Force. But regardless of whether she was the host or not, she was going to be the way in which the new birth of mutants began to crop up. The problem is that never really happened. Marvel didn't do anything with her character. She just kind of sat on the back burner for years and years and years and years. And it got to the point that by the time Avengers versus X-Men came around, people were just like, why is Hope Summers still here? Now, with regards to Cyclops, his character had become more and more extreme over the years. And the reason why was because, again, coming out of House of M, Charles Xavier was gone. Nobody knew where he went to. The Scarlet Witch said no more mutants, reality returned to a state of normalcy, minus the mutant population, being as large as it was, and Charles Xavier had vanished. And so in his absence, Cyclops and Emma Frost took over control of the X-Men. Now, Professor X did come back in a story called X-Men Deadly Genesis, and that introduced like Vulcan, the third Summers brother, so on and so forth. But it introduced a lot of the actions that Charles Xavier had done that he had kept hidden over the years. And the result was that Cyclops and Emma Frost more or less lost faith in him. And so they literally would not allow him to be leader of the X-Men. Instead, they took over and they said, you can be an advisor, and that's it. And so Xavier just kind of sat on the back burner, and that was really it. And again, the other part of this being the mutant population, with it being so small, the idea was to bring it back somewhere along the line to begin regrowing, or I guess, restoring the mutant population. And so with Avengers versus X-Men, this really does a lot of that, especially once we get to the end, with regards to Charles Xavier, the Phoenix Force, that kind of a thing. But the crazy thing about this is that the arrival of the Phoenix Force, it really comes with the arrival of Nova, of Sam Alexander. Now, the crazy thing about this is, I want to say there was a Marvel Infinite comic, which is basically like their digital only series. And it was really just like Sam Alexander trying to outrun the Phoenix Force as it was making its way back to Earth in order to warn the Avengers, really the superhero community, of what was going to happen. And ultimately, nobody could really, he wasn't able to make it in time, and the Phoenix more or less just kind of makes its presence known. Now, with regards to like Tony Stark and Captain America becoming aware of the fact that the Phoenix is returning, this is huge. And the reason why is because in the eyes of them, as well as virtually anybody else who was there when Jean Grey was the Phoenix, their first thought is whoever the host of the Phoenix Force is going to be is going to go awry. Now, through their own studies, through their involvement with the X-Men and so on, they know the host of the Phoenix is going to be Hope Summers. And therein lies the crux of Avengers versus X-Men. It's really just a battle for Hope Summers. It's making her as important as she's ever going to be in the line of Marvel Comics. But with regards to their stance on the Phoenix, for those of you guys who aren't really familiar with this idea in Marvel Comics, the way it originally played out is that Jean Grey was a character that just no one really cared about in the original X-Men comics. She was quite literally the quintessential damsel in distress. She could never, get through training sessions on her own. Cyclops always had to rescue her. The team always had to step in to save her life because she just never do anything worthwhile. When Chris Claremont took over the X-Men, he was like, that depiction of that character sucks. We're gonna make her cool. And so because of that, they introduced the Phoenix Force. Jean Grey became the Phoenix, which gave her just these godlike powers. But the idea was the longer the Phoenix posed as Jean Grey, the more the Phoenix began to experience emotions, anger, rage, love, all that kind of good stuff. And so because of that, the Phoenix became corrupted by emotion, and in doing so, became the Dark Phoenix. And so because she was the Dark Phoenix, Jean, or I guess the Phoenix posing as Jean, presented a credible threat to not just Earth, but the universe as a whole. Because remember, the Phoenix Force represents the sum total of all life that has and will ever exist in the Marvel multiverse. Not just the universe, but the multiverse. There's only one Phoenix Force throughout the multiverse. The Phoenix Force will have avatars, like the Phoenix can break itself off into pieces, and then one piece can appear in the Ultimate Universe, and one piece can appear in the main Marvel universe, and one piece can appear in another universe, and different things like that. But there's only ever one Phoenix Force. And so because of this, with Hope being so young and being so inexperienced, the initial concern of Captain America and the Avengers is that if the Phoenix takes over her, she's going to become the Dark Phoenix. It'll be the whole Jean Grey saga all over again, and it's going to lead to absolute pandemonium. Now, the other half of this equation is Cyclops himself. Now, of course, Cyclops here, when the Avengers show up and the Avengers confront him, it's really kind of a funny scenario because on the whole, it's just the X-Men against the Avengers, and really in the initial skirmish of all this. And once we actually get to about the midway point is when things start to change. But notice here, you have guys like Magneto, you have guys like Namor the Submariner. The reason why they're here is because of the fact that during the events of Dark Reign, which followed Secret Invasion, when Tony Stark was kicked out as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Norman Osborn was put in his place, Norman Osborn started implementing a campaign of world domination, or really kind of dominating the United States and then intending to dominate the world. But he created groups like the Dark Avengers, like the Dark X-Men, different things like that, which were basically villainous versions of popular superhero teams. But the idea was that the X-Men would not play ball with Norman Osborn. And because Norman only had control of the continental United States, they left the continental United States and went to an island they called Utopia. And so because of this, the X-Men were joined by Namor the Submariner, who is part mutant and rallied himself to his cause, alongside Magneto and a handful of others who just saw Cyclops as a legitimate leader of the X-Men, and were basically just kind of banding together because there were so few of them left. It's really just circumstance that kind of brought them all together. But the fact remains here, that's the reason why they're here. But with the X-Men showing up, Cyclops' stance is that there's only 200 of them left, and Hope Summers may be the key to returning the mutant population back to where it should be. That is to say, a whole new birth of mutants across the world. And so in Cyclops' mind, he's not the bad guy here, and that's the crazy thing. He's the good guy fighting on behalf of mutants who have yet to be born, who have yet to gain their powers, to have their X genes activated or their X genes given to them and then activated. And so, of course, this leads to the most logical scenario when the Avengers and the X-Men just start fighting one another. Now, in truth, there's really not a lot to be had here in terms of discussion. I mean, it's kind of cool to see, to see these guys going against one another, but the ultimate goal is to get Hope Summers out of there, to get Hope Summers to a different location so that she can be held safe away from the prying eyes of the Avengers themselves and the safety of the X-Men. But this is really Marvel just kind of showcasing the different abilities of the people who are here. I mean, the abilities of Spider-Man going against some of the X-Men, so on and so forth. But it's also the idea that certain people have to choose sides, namely Wolverine. Because remember, following the Avengers disassembled story, Wolverine was rolled over into the new Avengers team as it was formed by Captain America, Iron Man, alongside Spider-Man and a handful of others. And so at this particular point in his character's chronology, because this takes place before the death of Wolverine, he serves as both an Avenger and an X-Man. And so he's just kind of having to pick a side. Now, the funny thing about this is that Marvel plays it pretty fast and loose with his character and has him walk both lines. The closer the Phoenix Force gets to Earth, the more in tune Hope Summers becomes with the Phoenix Force's power. And so in a lot of ways, Wolverine, having been in love with Jean Grey, sees very much of her in Hope Summers, especially the kind of power she possesses, the emotions weapons she displays, that they get the better of her from time to time. And so where Hope Summers basically just kind of incapacitates everyone who's guarding her and races off, the other half of this is that another Avengers team has been sent into space in order to try to confront and stop the Phoenix Force before it gets to Earth. Now again, this is an impossible task. The Phoenix Force is just wildly powerful. It's way too strong. In fact, the Phoenix Force is so powerful that Marvel has yet to define an actual power set for the Phoenix. The Phoenix just has the ability to do whatever the host wants to do at any particular point in time. That's basically the power of the Phoenix. I mean, the only real description we have was given to us in Grant Morrison's New X-Men, I think it was. New X-Men, where it was just like the Phoenix just heals universes or just like fixes problems, quote unquote. That's all it does. Like, it just does whatever it needs to do. And so it just has omniversal power. It's insane what it is that it's capable of. And so the idea of the Avengers trying to stop it is absolute nonsense. But at the end of the day, where Hope Summers basically goes on the run, Wolverine actually catches up to her and serves the purpose of essentially helping her achieve her goal, which is to get to the moon and then in turn access the Phoenix Force. Now again, the funny thing about this is the idea that Wolverine's kind of picking and choosing his allegiances. I mean, this initially came out of a fight between him and Captain America, you know, where Captain America is beating the absolute hell out of Wolverine, Wolverine's beating the absolute hell out of Captain America. It's kind of ironic this is a pretty close fight because you wouldn't expect it to be, especially with, you know, Wolverine's training in all these different forms of martial arts. And so because of that, it's kind of funny to see this event unfold. But when Wolverine's effectively cast out, he tracks down Hope Summers and then helps her to get to the moon. Now, of course, with regards to this fight against the Phoenix, it's really like this last man standing with Thor. Thor is really like the last of the Avengers in space. Now, the other Avengers aren't dead. I mean, they're very much alive. It's just they can't fight anymore because they've more or less been incapacitated. But the funny thing about this is that it's Marvel showing us where the Phoenix Force stands in relation to a lot of the heroes that are out there. Because remember, for a lot of people, Avengers versus X-Men was their first exposure to the Phoenix Force. They'd never read like Phoenix Endsong, you know, they'd never read any of the Jean Grey saga under Chris Claremont. I mean, they never read any of that stuff. They've read about it online, but they never actually read the stories. And so because of that, seeing the Phoenix in full force is kind of interesting. But something that I want to point out here is that as far as this story goes, Matt Fraction had really kind of like nerfed the Phoenix. Like, he'd made it pretty weak in comparison to how it's actually supposed to be. I mean, you're talking about a multiversal force of pure omnipotence. I mean, it is virtually unstoppable. And so the kind of things that we'll see playing out here is kind of ironic because a person in full capacity of the Phoenix Force, which is to say the White Phoenix of the Crown, can warp reality on a universal and multiversal scale. They could just reform anything as they wanted to be, which kind of begs the question, where does the Phoenix reside in terms of all the powerful entities that are out there? And that's a video for another time. We did that once before, but we kind of have to change things up since new characters have been introduced and different things like that. But the fact remains here that with regards to the Avengers trying to track down Hope Summers, trying to find her location, all of them basically deduce the fact that she's heading to the moon, you know, where Wolverine's basically helping her get to an advanced idea mechanics tech station and then basically use a shuttle in order to get to the moon. Once they get there, this is kind of like this major conflict, this final battle that takes place. And the crazy thing about this is that it's like this last stand at the Alamo. It's this last attempt to try to end the Phoenix. Now, the other half of this is Tony Stark himself. Now, once we get into Iron Man Believe, Matt Fraction's run, this is the point that they're basically talking about when it comes to his actions in destroying the Phoenix. This is really kind of what the what that race, I can't remember what they were called, but what that race is referring to. Stark basically manufactures or develops a massive suit designed for the purpose of effectively destroying the Phoenix Force's life entity. But even then, that's why I say the Phoenix Force is so powerful, because it just represents life. And so in truth, in order for the Phoenix Force to truly be destroyed, you would have to wipe out all things in existence. I mean, literally just like wipe out the entirety of the multiverse with not a single scrap of energy left. Because if there's a single iota of energy, that energy will become space, and then it'll become stars, which in turn will form planets, which will grow life, and the Phoenix Force will exist. And so because of that, you'd literally have to wipe out all things in existence, which can't really happen. And so because of that, with the Phoenix Force finally emerging on the moon and making its presence known to Hope Summers, the initial idea is that if it seizes control of her again, it'll send her into a state of chaos because she's not emotionally ready to harness the full power of the Phoenix. Not even Jean Grey was, and she was a full-grown woman. Now, of course, as time progressed with Jean's character, she was able to kind of harness the Phoenix, but she was nowhere near as powerful as she was during the original Phoenix saga. It was more or less like the Phoenix power would just manifest occasionally, but it was reduced in strength by quite a bit. And so with Tony Stark basically attacking this Phoenix, ultimately what it ends up doing is instead of destroying the Phoenix Force, it splits its energy into 5 pieces, which go into Namor the Submariner, Emma Frost, Cyclops, Colossus, and Magic, Ilyana Rasputin, a Colossus' little sister. Now, why these particular 5 were chosen, I have not been able to find an interview that gives any real measure of explanation. It's just, they were the ones who were just there. I mean, it's just really done for the sake of storytelling. But the cool thing about this is it begs the question of how bad are their motives? Are their motives really that bad in the first place? Because what we end up doing is we actually pick up 10 days after the Phoenix Five are basically formed, and we travel to the island of Utopia. Now, what the Phoenix Five have basically done is to use their powers to transform Utopia into this Utopia place. Now, that's kind of the irony of it, is because of the fact that with the namesake of Utopia, when it was originally formed by the X-Men, it was basically a utopia of sorts that was designed to be kind of like a modern day version of Genosha. And what I mean here, I know we're covering a lot of X-Men history here, so bear with me, but Genosha was basically this place that existed for the purpose of being Magneto's own little home away from home. It was Magneto's place to basically have a location where mutants could be free from human oppression. It was a country that was governed by mutants that was only for mutants. Now, mutants could live elsewhere in the world if they wanted to, but it was just one of those things where you pay your money and take your chances. You live in New York, folks are gonna hate you because you're a mutant. If you live in San Francisco, they're gonna hate you because you're a mutant. If you live in Genosha, you're gonna live among your own kind. Now, there's a whole backstory in terms of why Magneto got Genosha in the first place and that kind of thing, but Genosha itself was destroyed in the first story arc of Grant Morrison's new X-Men that was basically called E is for Extinction. And so because of that, Genosha was just this wasteland. And so if you read like House of M or really any of the modern X-Men stories before All New, All Different Marvel, and you basically go and they show you the city of Genosha, that's why it's destroyed. It was just never rebuilt. Instead of rebuilding it during the whole Dark Reign story, Marvel just introduced Utopia, and it was just like Cyclops' version of Genosha, more or less. It was a safe haven for what was left of the X-Men. Now, the fact remains here that Charles Xavier is effectively brought into the equation, and this is one of the most important parts of the story, and the reason why is because of the fact that Cyclops is the first and oldest student of Charles Xavier, not necessarily in age, but he's the oldest in terms of the people who have been part of Charles Xavier's life the longest. He was the first student. He's the one that really shared so many of Xavier's ideologies, and that's one of the reasons why there were some people that loved Avengers versus X-Men, and there were some that hated Avengers versus X-Men. Now, we'll get a little more into that discussion once we get into the death of Charles Xavier, but the idea here is that what Cyclops basically says is your dream of a peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants is exactly what I'm bringing to you. Like, you've always wanted to see humans and mutants existing. You've always wanted to see the world to be basically this giant utopia. That's exactly what we're doing here. Now, the problem with this is that Cyclops is doing this at the edge of a gun. He's doing this with a weapon. He's basically pointing a gun at the heads of everybody and saying, if you don't do what I tell you to, I'm gonna pull the trigger. And so it's not really like a utopia so much as it is just like an enlightened monarch or an enlightened dictatorship. The funny thing about this is that Hope Summers is being kept on the island itself. And Hope's, I guess, really her kind of offering to be here is really more of like, hey, you can be here if you want to, but you can leave anytime you want. Now, we're gonna find out it's actually one of those fake scenarios where she's really not allowed to leave. But again, this really just kind of shows the stance of Cyclops, because what he does is he approaches her and says, hey, look, the power of the Phoenix Force is so seductive. If I were to offer it to you, what would be your answer? And of course, she says yes. Now, of course, Cyclops yanks away and says, but you're not ready for it. And this is the contradictory nature of his character. With absolute power, or at least as they say, absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's exactly what's going on with Cyclops right now, as well as the other Phoenix Five. They're being overcome by the power they possess. And it makes sense because it's like a drug. I mean, imagine for example, tomorrow you woke up and realized that you could warp reality, that with enough time, you could train yourself to do that. So you could go to like Best Buy and you could reach into your pocket and have as much money as you needed at that particular point in time. Or you could just not even need money. You could just say, you know what, I want a big 4K TV, and you just manifest it out of thin air. Imagine you had that kind of godlike power. Would you be willing to give it up? Would you be willing to let it go? Of course not. I mean, because you would genuinely believe, well, I can keep it contained. I can keep it controlled. I can keep it from allowing the world to run amok, but you can't see the future. You don't know what's going to happen. And it may very well lead to the destruction of yourself and everything that you hold dear. And that's really what's kind of being played here with regards to Cyclops, is he's losing himself in the power that he possesses. And that's why it's so extreme. That's why it's so intense, is because of the fact that Cyclops himself was, again, the oldest student of Charles Xavier. He followed Charles Xavier's ideology of a peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants in the extreme. He was the one champion, the one guy that Xavier could always count on to uphold his ideologies. With Cyclops falling so far so fast, it's this idea that he's almost reaching the point that he's beyond hope. Now, he will reach that place. He will reach that level that he's basically beyond any real measure of redemption. But what we end up doing here is we pick up with the Avengers, because again, their goal is to grab Hope Summers and their goal is to get her out of there, because the stance of Cyclops and the other Phoenix, I guess the other members of the Phoenix Phoenix Five is they're going to keep Hope Summers on Utopia. They're going to train her on how to use her powers effectively so that when the time comes, they will imbue her with the Phoenix Force and she will become the new Phoenix, and she'll basically be a harbinger of the rebirth of mutants across the earth. Well, again, from the Avengers standpoint, it's only a matter of time before she becomes corrupted by that power. And so what they do is they basically initiate a halo jump. Now, halo jumps are kind of cool. They seem kind of interesting. I've never served in the military, so I've never done one before, and I never would. But halo stands for high altitude, low open. And what that means is you usually jump from like 30,000 feet. But the idea is to jump from an extremely high altitude and then open at the very moment before you hit the bottom, relatively speaking, so that no one knows you're there. And that's the idea to pull off here. Now, under normal circumstances, from what I understand, with a halo jump, you usually attach flares to yourself somewhere on your body, like a foot or hand or something like that, so people know where you are. But in this instance, they're not doing that, because if they did, anybody in Utopia would look up and say, hey, what are those flares doing falling from the sky? And they would realize the Avengers are coming. And so the funny thing about this is that it's also the Avengers not really underestimating, but just taking their chances as best they can, because Emma Frost is one of the Phoenix Five. She's an Omega level telepath. She's wildly powerful in her telepathic abilities. You know, with the Phoenix powers, she can read the minds of everyone on Earth at the same time without being phased in any form or fashion. And so she knows the Avengers are coming. She knows they're on their way. But something that I want you to notice here is how manipulative she's going to become. That's something I want you to keep in the back of your head, because she's going to become a very significant and violent character. But ultimately, with Cyclops and Emma Frost making their presence, they essentially just kind of show up to confront the Avengers, but then the Avengers are met with the arrival of the Scarlet Witch. Now, this is basically Marvel just kind of reminding us, hey, look, the Scarlet Witch is still pretty powerful, but it's more so fear than it is legitimate power. The Scarlet Witch is more powerful as herself. She's more powerful than any one member of the Phoenix Five. But the Phoenix Five are terrified of the Scarlet Witch because, remember, she's the one that said no more mutants and stripped everybody of their powers. And so from their perspective, she's terrifying. You know, her power is extreme, and she could warp reality in such a degree that she can just remove mutant powers from everyone. Then what could she do against the Phoenix? Now, the important thing to keep in mind here is that the Scarlet Witch has been reduced in power. She's not House of M powerful anymore. That was a moment in time. That was it. That was the absolute peak and height of her powers. At this point, she's still pretty strong in terms of what she can do, but against the entirety of the Phoenix Force combined into one, she doesn't stand a chance. Like, she's just not that powerful. You know, really no one is. And so what we end up doing here is, of course, with the Scarlet Witch effectively whisking Hope Summers away and allying herself with the Avengers, what this does is it begins drawing lines in the sand. And this is Marvel effectively prepping the second part of the story, which is when a lot of the X-Men begin to defect away from the Phoenix Five because of the aggressive and the intense actions that they begin to take towards the globe and everybody in it as a whole. Okay, so with Avengers vs. X-Men Part 2, I haven't uploaded the first video yet. I'm kind of recording these back to back, but it's kind of crazy because I'll record the first video, the first segment, and then I'll just be like, I think people are gonna have questions about this, or they're gonna have questions about that, or something along those lines. I try to predict what you guys are gonna ask as best I can, and then try to answer them as we get through the video, but sometimes I just can't. Sometimes you guys just throw like these crazy questions, you know, like it's kind of funny. Like, I'll be on Twitter sometimes, and I'll just like tweet out to Emergency Awesome and just be like, hey man, like, you had a really good video, and then somebody will just be like, who do you think would win in a fight? And it's just kind of it's just kind of funny to me. But in any event, the whole idea of Avengers vs. X-Men, one of the major things this was designed to do was to really kind of throw into sharp relief how much more powerful the Avengers were than the X-Men. Because with the idea of the Phoenix Five, the Phoenix Force really just kind of like amplifies their powers in the extreme. And so it's really kind of a crazy scenario, because on the whole, the Avengers have always been weaker than the X-Men, but it was always designed to be that way. The Avengers were always designed to have powers that were really more human than anything else. I mean, you did have Avengers with exotic abilities, but for the most part, like Thor or like the Incredible Hulk were really like the most powerful Avengers. Whereas with the X-Men, you had characters like Vulcan who could manipulate any form of energy. You had characters like, you know, Charles Xavier, who was just wildly powerful telepath. You had people like, you know, Scarlet Witch, for example, who was an X-Man at one point, who had the ability to warp reality. I mean, you have Franklin Richards, who's a mutant that can warp reality. I mean, you have all different kinds of characters with these extreme levels of powers. And so because of that, the X-Men and the mutant population were always designed to be stronger. Now, I wouldn't go as far as to say this was Marvel just kind of being like, the Avengers suck. I don't really think that was the case. I think it was really just kind of designed to show us how powerful a group of X-Men can be with the entirety of the Phoenix Force at their disposal. And so really, it's in a lot of ways, it's just kind of like these hit and run tactics. The Avengers really have no choice here. Now, the other half of this is the idea that the Avengers are trying to think about it from a technological standpoint, but the Phoenix Force is life energy. There's really no technology behind it. The Phoenix Force is not like a series of nanites that are just like running around and immerse themselves in flame and take on the form of a phoenix. It's not that way. It's the representation of life energy. They're basically dealing with energy forces, but the Avengers don't really have very many people on their side who can deal with that. The most powerful two beings they have at the moment right now on the Avengers roster is Scarlet Witch and Doctor Strange, and their power only goes so far. Remember, Doctor Strange's power was nerfed already. I mean, you had that whole story where you had classic Doctor Strange who could do virtually anything, but he lost his gift from the Vishanti who gave him the various magics that he could use. He lost his connection with them when he refused to fight alongside them in a war in the dimensional plane. And so once he regained his powers, he only regained a fraction of the power he used to have. And so he's not nearly as powerful as he used to be. Otherwise, he could just end this right now. He could just eliminate the Phoenix Force and it would just be done, and that would be it. And so because of that, there's a lot of folks here, on the Avengers side who are dealing with it as best they can, but they're just woefully outmatched. They're just not quite capable. And that's why we end up seeing things like Doctor Strange, grabbing these little items like the enchantments of Icon. That's why we have people like Black Panther saying, we have to consult Bast, the Panther God. They're reaching for whatever they can. They're just grasping at straws to try to find a way to defeat the Phoenix Five. And it really shows the desperation of the Avengers where they are right now, because they really don't have a choice. They're really doing the best they can with what they have, and that's really about it. Now, in terms of the manipulative nature of Emma Frost, this really comes to fruition with regards to Namor the Submariner. Now, the implication here is that the two of them are having an affair, that the two of them are basically sleeping together. Now, this is really just kind of given to us through the fact that they share a kiss, that kind of thing, but Emma Frost also says, look, I know where they took one of our own. I know where they took Transonic, a member of our group, and she's being kept in Wakanda. Now, the reason why this is Emma Frost being so manipulative is because of the fact that she's basically going to lead to Namor's destruction, or really not death per se, but him losing his portion of the Phoenix Force. But Emma Frost has always been this way. Emma Frost has always been manipulative, going all the way back to really even before Grant Morrison's time on New X-Men, really during Grant Morrison's time and Chuck Dixon's time on New X-Men, when Jean Grey walked in on a psychic affair between Cyclops and Emma, which kind of led to Jean Grey basically being forced out of the picture and Emma Frost and Cyclops pairing up. The fact remains here that Emma's always been that way. Now, for a lot of, especially women readers, that was a refreshing thing, because they looked at her as like an empowered chick, right? Like she does whatever she needs to do in order to achieve her goal. But the downside of this was that it made her look very vindictive and it made her look very petty. And so it really kind of took away from her accomplishments because of the road she took to get there. But the fact remains that with regards to the whole, tension between Black Panther and Namor the Submariner, this comes by way of the fact that Namor attacks Wakanda. Now, it's not as though he just does this blindly. I mean, he does to a degree, but Emma Frost was preying on the desire of Namor to engage in conflict and engage in war. Namor's always been a very heavy-handed character when it came to like dealing with enemies in terms of, Marvel Comics. If somebody just strayed across Atlantis, or even if they accidentally harmed somebody from Atlantis, Namor the Submariner was like, throw him in prison and kill him, and that was it. That's just the way it was. I mean, there were no ifs, ands, or buts. You harmed somebody from Atlantis and you were done with all your living, according to Namor the Submariner. This is an extension of that belief system with an almost infinite amount of power. And so with the kind of ability that he possesses, he looks at Cyclops as a failure in a lot of ways, because what Namor says is, this is war. If you're not with us, you're against us. And if you're against us, you're in the way. You chose your side and you knew what was coming. Sorry about your luck. That's really just kind of the stance that he takes. And so him attacking Wakanda is the most natural progression of his character. Now, the other half of this brings into the idea Kunlun. Now, really, Matt Fraction's just kind of like bringing some of the stuff that he did with regards to Iron Fist into the equation, which is one of the reasons why we covered the run of Iron Fist. But there was a point in the history of Kunlun when one of the Iron Fists, long before Danny Rand, had basically faced against and staved off somebody who basically became a host for the Phoenix Force. Now, there isn't a whole lot of expansion given there. It's basically just saying, this is one of the things that one of the many Iron Fists throughout the history of the Iron Fist mantle have done. Just one of the multitude of things that they've achieved. But what it does is it brings Kunlun in because it means they have experience with the Phoenix. None of them have become a Phoenix entity, but they have experience with it on how to train their Iron Fist to cope with the Phoenix Force. Now, at the end of the day, Danny Rand, the Iron Fist, going against any one of the Phoenix Five is like throwing a rock at a train. I mean, it's not going to do anything. I mean, it's comedic at best, and all he can really do is just buy time. And even then, it's seconds, maybe. I mean, he just doesn't stand a chance. The Iron Fist is just nowhere near powerful enough. But what this does do is it grants a reprieve for Hope Summers, Wolverine, and a handful of others to basically retreat and then use Kunlun as a base of operations. Because remember, Kunlun is in another dimension, so you literally have to cross a dimensional barrier to get to Kunlun. It's like that phrase from Pirates of the Caribbean. It's a place that cannot be found except by those who already know where it is. But the fact remains here that with regards to Wakanda, Namor the Submariner's actions here just lay waste to the city. I mean, he basically musters all of his forces and just brings them to bear onto Wakanda and just eradicates the entirety of the city, killing tons of people in the process. Now, this creates a blood vendetta between Black Panther and Namor the Submariner. And so when we get to Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers and we start referencing things like why it is that Black Panther hates Namor the Submariner so much, we will point back to this story so you guys can see what it is that we're talking about. Now, with regards to Namor the Submariner effectively being defeated, he loses his portion of the Phoenix Force. But what we end up finding out here is that when one member of the Phoenix Five loses their connection to the Phoenix Force, the remainder of the Phoenix Force, or I guess that portion, spreads throughout the remainder of those individuals who were bonded to the Phoenix. And so because of this, what it does is it sets the seeds for a civil war between the remainder of the Phoenix Five, really the Phoenix Four now, because they're all imbued with Namor the Submariner's power. And so the idea in all of their minds, the idea in the mind of Cyclops, and the mind of Emma Frost, the mind of Colossus, the mind of Illyana Rasputin is if everybody else dies or everybody else loses their connection, they'll basically maintain the totality of the Phoenix Force. And so what it does is just kind of make this race to bring all the others down. And so because of this, we end up picking up like 8 days after the, basically the fall of Namor the Submariner. And what we end up finding out here is that using Kunlun as a base of operations, the Avengers are launching these attacks to basically go into the main Marvel universe, grab what other members of the Avengers they can, and bring them back. And so really the Phoenix Five, or really I guess the Phoenix Four at this point, have just kind of taken over the earth. I mean, there's really no way for the Avengers to stand on their own. Now, in the background of all this, Hope Summers is basically being trained in a lot of the various forms of mysticism and martial arts available to Kunlun. Now, the funny thing about this is that like Kung Fu is not going to do her any good, but the idea of her being trained in Kung Fu isn't about like kicks and punches and self-defense. It's about her honing her soul, coming to grips with who she is, what she's about, and getting a better understanding of herself. And so because of that, it makes her more in tune with her own powers, gives her kind of like a spiritual peace, which in turn will give her better access and a better understanding of her own powers and make her more formidable. Because in the end, it all really comes down to her. I mean, right now, the Avengers are in shambles. I mean, whether it's Captain Britain, which he never really mattered, like Scarlet Witch, Ant-Man, Red Hulk, She-Hulk, Wolverine, I mean, they're all basically just being completely crushed. With regards to, Tony Stark, everybody's doing all the research they can, but in the end, it doesn't matter. It doesn't make a difference. They're all basically being taken down. And so what we end up doing is joining the Avengers, as they basically make this, another campaign into the main Marvel universe, but we end up finding that Illyana Rasputin uses her powers to basically command the forces of Limbo and essentially brings in hell on Earth. Now, in the realm of Marvel Comics, Limbo is one of a multitude of dimensions that are basically hell. I mean, you have a lot of those. Like, you actually have the dimension of hell, which is where Mephisto hangs out at. And Mephisto is basically the devil in Marvel Comics, but there's a lot of dimensions that are filled with like fire and brimstone and demons and monsters and different things like that. But Limbo is a dimension that Illyana Rasputin has total control of and calls her own. She's basically queen of that realm. And so because of that, when she brings it over to Earth, most of the Avengers are able to get out in time, but Spider-Man is really kind of like the last man left, offering what little solace he can, offering what little safety he can, while the Avengers rescue those who have been taken by the rest of the Phoenix Four. And so what ends up happening is Spider-Man actually manipulates the two of them. And this is one of the coolest things here, because in the Renew Your Vows story from Secret Wars, one of the things that Marvel established is that Spider-Man tells jokes for the purpose of throwing off his enemies. Whereas enemies are taking the situation seriously, when it seems like Spider-Man's not taking them seriously, it throws them off. It keeps them off guard, knocks them off balance, because they don't know what to expect. It's like the classic Bruce Lee method of fighting, right? I mean, don't clench your fist until the moment of impact, dance around, always be on the move. Spider-Man is much the same way in terms of how he conducts himself. But the way he does this is he preys on his knowledge of the defeat of Namor the Submariner and begins talking to Illyana Rasputin and Colossus, basically saying, you guys are brother and sister. Do you guys really want to fight each other? I mean, why would you want to fight each other? Because if one of you falls, the other will get, that person's power. And so what he does is he basically plants this little thought in their brains that if Colossus takes out Magic, or if Magic takes out Colossus, they'll gain the other other's power. And so at this point, it's really just kind of feeding on their bloodlust, feeding on their corruption, and just kind of going from there, just letting nature take its course. And so things unfold exactly as we would expect it to when Illyana Rasputin and Colossus end up fighting one another, and it ultimately results in both of them being defeated and the remainder of their power spreading to Emma Frost and Cyclops. And so because of this, Cyclops effectively locates Kunlun, breaks into it with the intention of grabbing Hope Summers and bringing her back. And so because of the stance that people like Emma Frost are taking, where she's basically forcing mutants that are in Utopia into subservience, because Cyclops is becoming so extreme and willing to kill anyone who gets in his way, ultimately Magneto begins to see himself in the two of them. And that's what's so ironic here about this. One of the reasons why Magneto's character was so cool during Avengers versus X-Men is because how we see Cyclops and Emma Frost depicted here, this is 1990s Magneto. Hell, this is 1980s, 1970s Magneto. The guy who will do whatever it takes in order to keep mutants safe, even if it means crushing and conquering the world. And so because of this, Magneto does the only thing he can do. He basically walks out into the open and contacts Charles Xavier and says, "We need your help on this." Now, Xavier was well aware of what was going on up to this point, but he had always kind of been hands off. He had always sort of stayed away from everything that was going on, simply because of the fact that in his mind, there had to be a peaceful way to bring Cyclops back. And he was really just kind of biding his time and waiting for that moment to talk Cyclops down and bring him back to his normal self before he was too far corrupted from the Phoenix's power. But at the end of the day, we also get a better understanding of Hope Summers' powers, in the sense that Hope Summers can basically duplicate the powers of others, that whenever she's in a close proximity of a person, she can copy their abilities. Now, the cool thing about this is that she can do it with more than one. So she's like Peter Petrelli from Heroes Season 1 before they nerfed his character and screwed him up. And so because of that, she's basically a character who's just a living copycat of anybody else's powers, which makes her wildly powerful. Because imagine that she was standing in close proximity to Emma Frost and Colossus, Scarlet Witch, or something like that. She'd have all three of their powers. She could use Emma Frost's telepathy, she could use Scarlet Witch's reality warping powers, and she would have the organic metal skin of Colossus. It's kind of crazy what it is that she can do. And so what we end up doing is we basically jump back over to Captain America. And this is really the Avengers in their most desperate hour, because what we do is we join Captain America out in the middle of nowhere. And Captain America is just beseeching some unknown person, simply saying, "Look, we've exhausted every option. We need every ounce of help that we can get. I would not come here unless it was absolutely necessary, but I absolutely need your help. Will you help me? You have to have been seeing what was going on with the Avengers and the X-Men. Will you help me with this conflict?" And we ultimately end up finding out the person that Captain America is talking to is the Incredible Hulk. Now, this is so cool. And the reason why is because of the fact that after Greg Pak's run, we ended up getting the Incredible Hulk by Jason Aaron. But basically, he just went into like a period of self-imposed exile. He just disappeared off the face of the planet for however long. He just stayed hidden from everybody. And so with the Incredible Hulk being brought in here, this brings in a massive powerhouse. At the same time, we also end up joining or traveling to Wisconsin and joining Rogue. And Rogue basically joins the Avengers. And what we end up finding out here is that Charles Xavier has effectively been going alongside the Avengers and mustering all these forces that are Avengers and X-Men related. And so what this is designed to do is to show us that people have basically walked away from Cyclops and Emma Frost. They've lost faith in them. They've lost faith in their mission. And that's really where it is that Cyclops and like Magneto began to stray. That's where they really began to kind of part ways, is because historically speaking, Magneto was always mutants first. If there's any group that can count on me to ensure their safety, it will always be mutants. Everybody else is second best. Cyclops initially presented himself this way. And that's why so many mutants rallied to his cause, is because he showed up and said, "Look, we're going to turn this mutant island of Utopia, we're going to turn it into a refuge for mutants." But then it ended up going, from being this enlightened dictatorship to turning into this totalitarian, power-hungry regime. And that's when mutants began to walk away, especially those individuals who were looking at the Avengers and saying, "Look, we fought as friends once, we'd like to fight as friends again," because Cyclops and Emma Frost are beyond the point of control. And so because of this, we end up joining Xavier, kind of entering into Cyclops' mind. And this is cool because it's a battle being fought on two fronts. On one side, it is Xavier in the mind of Cyclops, more or less kind of talking to him, offering some measure of distraction. On the outside, it is all the Avengers and these X-Men facing off against Cyclops. And so it's really kind of cool because it's just like Cyclops versus everyone. And it's amazing to see, because at the end of the day, Emma Frost and Cyclops are the last two standing. And try as they might, the Avengers just don't have the power to take both these guys out on their own because they're just so strong. strong. They're just so capable. And so because of this, in this moment of desperation, in this hour of basically realizing he needs more power, Cyclops turns against Emma Frost. And in doing so, basically incapacitates her and steals her portion of the Phoenix Force, which basically transforms him into Dark Phoenix. Now, again, this is the crazy thing here, is because this shows us how far Cyclops has fallen. And this was designed for the purpose of ushering in Cyclops into a new era, of taking Cyclops in a new direction to where he would be more extreme. He would become like the classic Magneto, but in a more extreme capacity. So for those of you guys who are reading the stories or are online reading different articles about how Cyclops has basically quote unquote gone evil, this is the story that set the stage for that. But the first act he does with the totality of the Phoenix Force's powers is kill Charles Xavier. And this was really like him crossing a line that he can't come back from. Now, the other half of this is that in some ways it is Marvel giving Cyclops an out. It's basically Marvel saying, this is what happens when a person becomes fully imbued with the power of the Phoenix Force. They don't know how to control it. They fall down the path of darkness because it's so much power that they almost go completely insane. And in some cases, when they become the Dark Phoenix, they do lose their minds in their entirety. And so this is really just like a last-ditch effort by everyone to try to stave off and try to end the power of Cyclops once and for all. And so what ends up happening here is Hope Summers and Scarlet Witch effectively team up to bring Cyclops down. Now, the cool thing about this is that it's also this idea that Cyclops recognizes how far it is that he's falling. And it's really him just kind of recollecting on his own memories, going back and looking at the times that he and Wolverine fought together, looking at the times that he was a student of Xavier, the death of Jean Grey. These are moments that he looks back on and he begins to realize that he's effectively losing himself. But the problem is that what's happening to Cyclops now is exactly what happened to Jean Grey. Corrupted by power, not able to control it, the Phoenix Force takes on a life of its own. And so using a moment of distraction, Hope Summers just kind of immerses, through this fire looking like Jean Grey. But in this brief second, she takes the moment alongside Scarlet Witch to basically take out Cyclops, to beat him and then absorb the entirety of the Phoenix. Now, the implication seems to be here that the Phoenix was always trying to find its way back to Hope Summers, and it was just kind of doing so. And so it seems like there was some measure of personal control by Cyclops over the Phoenix, that he basically wouldn't let the Phoenix leave. That seems to kind of be what's happening here. And the problem is that with this end of the story, it just wraps up just like that. It wraps up so fast, and there's really not much in the way of a great ending here, because it's just really kind of like, well, where do we go from here? And what ends up happening is Hope Summers, having been perfectly in tune with the Phoenix Force, becomes the White Phoenix of the Crown. The problem with this, and the reason why it doesn't make any sense, is because Jean Grey was always billed to be the perfect host for the Phoenix, which is why she became the White Phoenix of the Crown. She and the Phoenix Force were effectively one and the same. She was born to be a host for the Phoenix. When she basically died, quote unquote, and joined the Phoenix Force and became the White Phoenix of the Crown, she was going to be the one singular being that basically fixes what's broken in the universe, whatever that happens to mean, whatever Marvel wants it to mean at any particular point in time. With Hope Summers becoming the White Phoenix of the Crown and Jean Grey nowhere in sight, the question has to be asked, what happened to Jean? But before we even get an answer to that question, before we ever find out what happens, Scarlet Witch more or less just kind of approaches Hope Summers and says, no, you were never really meant to have the Phoenix Force. And she simply says, no more Phoenix, and the Phoenix Force is destroyed. And that's it. And so it's a very anticlimactic and lackluster ending to what was otherwise an insanely great story. But what comes out of the death of the Phoenix Force, more or less, is basically this emergence of mutants all over the world. Mutant powers begin cropping up and popping back up all over again. And so once the story really begins to wind down, once it all basically begins to come to a close, Cyclops is effectively taken prisoner by the Avengers because of the fact that he had killed Charles Xavier. He's taken prisoner, he's basically held in stasis, but it sets the stage for him to effectively break out and then eventually go on to, lead his own group of X-Men, or, more of like a rogue group and so on. And then of course, Hope Summers just kind of takes off into the sky to find her own place. But again, it's not the best ending. I was really disappointed in the ending to the story because it kind of felt like Marvel wrote themselves into a hole and didn't know how to get out. But in any event, if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.